Production funding for After Abbey on WPSU comes from The Village at Penn State, Claiborne's Home Furnishings, Blaze Alexander Family Dealerships, America's Carpet Outlet, and from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to After Abbey, the live post-Downton Abbey interactive talk show. I'm Whitney Sheridan along with my co-host Lindsay Whistle. Joining us in the studio this evening is historian Andy August. He studies class and gender in 19th and 20th century Britain. He is the author of books and journal articles including The British Working Class, 1832 to 1940. Dr. August is a professor of history at Penn State Abington, where he has taught since 1995. You can be a part of this conversation right now. We're looking for your questions about tonight's episode and, in fact, the entire series. Call us at 1-800-543-8242. Send a note to After Abbey at WPSU.org, Facebook.com/AfterAbbeyTV, or on Twitter at After Abbey. Andy, thank you so much for being a part of tonight's show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Well, I guess one of the things I wanted to start with was a big plot line that seems to be getting a little bit of resolution, and that happens to be around Edith and Marigold this week. You know, lots happening with them. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was, you know, this idea we had brought up at the dinner table. Larry Merton, of course, in his rude behavior, mentioned the fact that, you know, a single woman raising a child like Marigold, that would be a lot of baggage for a man to take on, should she, you know, take on a husband or go out there, I guess, and take a suitor on. What would it have been like at that time for her to jump back into the dating pool, so to speak, with a child, a single mom?
I think that it seemed to me that she's sort of given up on the whole dating scene, that she's moving on from that. But in terms of how people might view someone who comes with that kind of baggage, I think it's important to remember that people were dying from disease, or it wasn't unusual for marriages to be ruptured. Mm-hmm. Divorce was relatively rare, but there were other things that happened.
I mean, Mary's a single mother.
Right, that's true. Mary's a single
there's
mother.
Plenty of people chasing her, right? Mm-hmm. And the war, so there were lots of people mm-hmm. whose husbands would have been killed in the war. Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't be so unusual to have a woman of marriageable age who didn't have a husband who might have a child or children. But it didn't seem like Edith is really worried about that.
Right. And they had this idea they brought up about her adopting Marigold as part of the ruse, you know, to keep her in the house. Do we think that was something that she would have been legally able to do? I mean, even though we know that Marigold is her daughter, but legally would a woman in, you know, the 1920s been able to adopt, a single woman?
I know a good bit more about poor communities, mm-hmm. and in poor communities it's very common for neighbors or relatives to take in children and raise them, and I don't really know if they go through the whole legal process of formal adoption, but it's not unusual in those communities to have children who are taken in because of hard times, mm-hmm. because families can't afford as many children as they have, and so that kind of being raised by others wasn't terribly rare. I don't know about in aristocratic households or taking in a poor child, an orphan.
Foundling, as they.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of me feels like, okay, well, that seemed to be a very obvious conclusion from the start of this whole plot line. But then another part of me thinks, I feel like it's a little bit obvious in a different way that people are going to look at this, okay, this, you know, aristocratic woman suddenly just adopted this child. Something else is going on here. So, I mean, would that have been something you saw, or would that have been like people thinking, okay, well, she's a redhead and she looks a little bit like her adopted mom?
Does seem like it might raise suspicions.
Definitely.
And we have some other plot lines developing. We have the beautiful proposal with Atticus and Rose, and it seems like all you need is a cup of tea and you're rushing down the aisle because they haven't known each other all that long. But we have hints of kind of tensions that could come about because of the difference in faith. And you know, in Cora's family, they have a Jewish background, and mm-hmm. it hasn't seemed to be an issue, but I'm wondering now with Rose and Atticus, would that have been something where they would be likely to experience intolerance
I do think so. I thought it was a wonderful little interaction where Cora said, "Oh, but we didn't change our name." I thought that was really funny
Right.
at the dinner table. But I do think that they would run into people looking skeptically from both sides. Obviously, that's what the plot line is showing. It wouldn't have been accepted, certainly in that aristocratic environment. But times are changing. You know, that's the theme of the whole show, and so this is part of what's breaking down.
And we were talking about, you know, while we were watching Downton earlier today, about, you know, Lord Cinderby's, his career and that impact as well. Can you tell us a little bit about him being a banker and, you know, how that might have impacted his social circle in addition to his faith?
Well, in the middle of the 19th century, so 75 years before where we are now in the show, the wealthiest families were all families like the Crawleys, the very wealthy aristocratic families who had their money from land. But in the later 19th century, the amount of resources that you could get from a landed estate declined dramatically, and at the same time, the kind of return you could get on other kinds of investments increased tremendously. So there are all of these new, very wealthy families of business backgrounds, and that's happening more and more through the 19th century, but by the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, aristocratic landed estates are less lucrative, and so families coming in through business have a lot of wealth, and they also are buying up estates of these aristocratic families who can no longer support their households. And that's what Robert's been struggling with throughout, right? How do we keep this estate together? Mm-hmm. So that it would be a kind of invasion of the elites by these new business classes. And certainly people would be conscious of that difference as well as the difference in being Jewish or not.
So definitely Lord Cinderby might be a little bit on the outside of the social circles.
And we saw that a little bit with Mary's previous fiance, right? The newspaper man, I can't remember his name.
Oh, Carlisle.
Yes.
Mr. Carlisle.
Yeah.
Right, so he was fabulously wealthy, but he
But
was
he
a
was
press
new-
baron.
and he
right?
was
It's
also new money.
Right? And
Yeah.
he was going to buy the estate nearby.
Right.
I still love that scene where they go through the estate, and she says, "Well, what are we going to put in here? Where are we going to get things?" And he goes, "Like normal people will buy them, and in her world, you just inherit things.
Right,
you don't
right.
actually buy them."
But it's all new money for him.
Exactly. Well, I want to go to a tweet that we've received from a viewer. Blake tweets, "Is Tom really going to leave? I hope not." Well, we know we've seen Tom Branson looking at going to Boston, I think with his cousin. And that's something that he's been going back and forth about, and even going so far as to talk to Sibby about potentially going away and moving and starting a new life together. So tell us a little bit about what was, especially since Tom, we know, has, you know, very strong political views. Tell us what was going on in, you know, the United States at that time.
Well, one of the things that I think has been de-emphasized a little bit is his Irishness. And so there are a lot of Irish immigrants in Britain, but not so many of them who are living in aristocratic households as part of the family. And so he's kind of cut off from an Irish community, his Irishness really. And in Boston, of course, there's a very large Irish immigrant community, and that's what he was referring to. So I think it's not just sort of moving out of the house and finding his own way. I suspect that if we're thinking about him as an example of looking for his identity and looking for his community, I think that Irishness is important there.
Yeah, I feel like we've heard a lot of people talk about potentially going to the States here. So would this have been sort of a time of exodus where people were looking for new horizons, new opportunities?
There isn't huge immigration at this point in the United States. Immigration is closed down around 1920. The laws change and make it much more difficult for people to come.
Okay.
There was huge immigration, not so much from Britain, but from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe around the turn of the 20th century. But then there's a reaction and a desire to limit immigration. So it's not like there are floods of immigrants coming into the United States in the 1920s, but there was already well-established immigrant communities.
Well, I want to go to a call from Joy from Martinsburg. Joy, welcome to After Abbey.
Hello.
Do we have Joy on the line?
Thank you for
Joy,
talking
welcome
me.
to After Abbey.
Yes.
Okay, I think we'll get Joy back in just a little bit, but first I wanted
Hello?
to ask.
She's on.
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah.
I don't hear Joy.
Hello.
So Joy, what's your question?
I was wondering how common a practice
I don't
it
have
was
Joy online. Do you hear Joy? Okay.
How
Hello?
common a practice it is?
for wealthy aristocratic people to take illegitimate children and put them with common families to be raised. My great-grandmother was one of those children.
Okay, so Joy was saying her great-grandmother was a child who had been taken in by an aristocratic family to be raised, and she's wondering how common that was.
I'm not sure
No,
she was.
she was an aristocratic child who was given to a poor family.
Oh, okay. She was an aristocratic child given to a poor family. So would that have been?
But she was illegitimate.
Oh, I see. Interesting. That is a lot of parallels. I don't know how common that would be, but if there were issues with preserving the reputation of the mother, like we see with Edith, it would certainly be a logical choice. And I think, as we were saying before, that among poor people, this kind of taking in is not unusual. So it's not like it's going to be raising a lot of eyebrows that here's this child who is now being raised by this other family. But I don't know about children born out of wedlock in aristocratic families if it was widespread. It's interesting that your family had the same kind of experience.
Yeah, as Marigold with the Drews. So interesting.
Well, thanks for that call, Joy. One of the things, that we had going on tonight, of course, was Isabel and Lord Merton, coming out with their engagement. And of course, at first, the first announcement was a very happy occasion. The second, bringing in Lord Merton's sons, not so happy an occasion. And that leads me to want to talk a little bit about the struggles that they might have with, Lord Merton marrying someone of a different class. She's a middle class, a woman of middle class. So let's talk a little bit about, of course, it's a great fairy tale to think that a middle class woman would get to marry an aristocrat. Of course, we have it in a lot of movies and books, of course. We all think about it. But in reality, what kind of obstacles would there have been? Would she have really been accepted?
I think one of the things that character of Larry points out is the kind of attitudes that I think would be much more common than what we see in the Crawleys, right? The Crawleys have been very welcoming to all sorts, and Larry
like Tom
comments on
Branson.
that.
Right.
And his class background, his Irishness, his Catholicism, they seem open to the possibility of a Jewish son-in-law. They are kind of welcoming almost a kind of multicultural family, which I think is a little bit of a comment on contemporary issues and ideas in Britain about whether we should be welcoming or hostile to immigrants. I think the producers of the show are making a comment on that. But I think that there would have been a lot of people with attitudes like Larry, and I think he's kind of in there to remind us of what's out there. And we see a little bit of it from the Crawleys now and then. Earlier on, we saw Robert saying something very hostile to Catholicism. I don't know if you remember that in an earlier season. But then he gets over that when Tom is brought into the family. But a lot of people weren't getting over things like that. So I do think that there's a lot of those attitudes out there. On the other hand, there's a lot of marriages like Robert's marriage to a daughter of a businessman. I mean, he married her for the money, but she wasn't from an aristocratic background. And also, it's not like Isabel's going to have children who are going to be threats to the heirs.
Right.
So I think he's just intolerant, partially because of his attitudes and his class position, and partially because of the family dynamics.
But, out in their regular social circles, she probably would have been accepted, do you think? With their friends, with acquaintances.
And their connections. I mean, she's connected to.
She's connected to the Crawleys, so.
Right, but she did make it clear that she wasn't originally going to go when they were doing the London season. That was not the kind of thing that she was going to participate in, right? And she went because it was Rose coming out, I guess.
Right.
But they had to kind of convince her to go. So even though in their Yorkshire circles. She seems to be accepted within their families. She's not participating in the full aristocratic
Right.
life.
Right.
Well, we had another reaction to Isabel's potential marriage, and I think that's one of the great scenes of this season.
And
is Violet.
It really showcased Dame Maggie Smith's. It gave us a chance to really showcase her acting talents,
which we just see it in her face, and it's
I
such a
know.
great scene that she's going to miss her friend.
It was so great to give her that opportunity on screen to show something other than, we love the barbs and the little quips that we get from Dame Maggie Smith, but it was great to see this emotion from her.
She's been very humanized this season with her Prince Karagan and with her losing Isabel, so some nice moments with
And
her.
I would have suspected, as Mary did, that she was jealous of Isabel's
Sure.
change in social position, and she kind of put her in her place pretty quickly.
Sure, that was great.
A couple times tonight she put her in her place.
She did at the dinner table. That was great too. I want to remind you, if you're just joining us, this is After Abbey, the live post-Downton Abbey interactive talk show, and we invite your correspondence. Call us at 1-800-543-8242. Send a note to afterabbey@wpsu.org, facebook.com/AfterAbbeyTV, or on Twitter @AfterAbbey. And in fact, we go to a question on Twitter right now. Greg tweets, sad to see Isis is passing away, but glad the storyline is treating it so gently and kindly. And that's true. It's always hard to see, an animal, a beloved animal, passing away on a show, and Isis has certainly been a part of Downton from the very beginning. I don't know what they'll do with the opening of the show.
I think in memoriam they'll probably leave it. But
They
yeah, that
probably
is
will.
beautiful. They're taking him into bed.
I
And,
know.
let him be surrounded by love. It's a great send
So
off.
it was very good,
And even Mary was sympathetic.
which we haven't seen
More
a lot
sympathetic
of.
to Isis than she is to Edith. But
We haven't seen a lot of that lately from Mary. So yeah. We also have a call from Linda from Pittsburgh. Linda, welcome to After Abbey.
Oh, thank you so much.
do you want to go ahead with your question, Linda?
Sure. My question is about Lady Mary and her suitors. I know that Tony's out of the picture now, but I was wondering about her and Charles, because she made a comment somewhere about that he said that there would never be anything between them, but I'm just wondering if there's a possibility that there still could be.
So we're wondering if Charles and Mary still have a shot now that they had their scandalous scene at what did he call it? The kinema?
The
Cinema, yeah.
the cinema, right.
At the movie theater, yeah.
So,
Yeah,
and he's leaving for Poland.
He's leaving for Poland,
Indefinitely.
but what do we think? Are Charles and Mary finally?
Oh, I
gonna-
think Charles and Mary, there's something there.
They kind of let it cool. I was actually very surprised that her and Tony heated up this season, because I thought there was a very clear kind of push toward Charles, and then he kind of dropped off the scene for a little while.
But they do seem to be setting them up as friends, which is the pattern with Matthew. They were friends, and then they got together, so maybe this is how she's going to find him, because he's more equal in terms of intelligence, right? He said,
Exactly.
Tony's not smart enough for you.
He's
Right.
much more her equal, and they spar, and they,
And maybe
battle of wits.
giving them some distance will make her miss him a little bit.
Well, and I love that look after he kisses her at the theater, and she just kind of has that whoa.
Yeah.
So I think that's
So I
telling
think
us
we'll have to
something.
wait and see what happens there. I think there are definitely more sparks with Charles Blake than with Tony Gillingham, certainly.
I was always Team Charles, but
You were always Team Charles. One of the things that we've been seeing, and it's been so great to see Daisy evolve this season. Certainly she was being tutored by Miss Sarah Bunting, who we all had different feelings about, conflicted feelings about throughout the season. But now that
mine
she's
weren't
gone,
conflicted.
but now that she's gone, we have Mosley is working with Daisy. And this week, it was sad to hear her say that she had such hopes of the Labor government and feels let down. And she's worried that all her studying won't matter in the long run. So I just want to talk a little bit, Andy, about this first Labor government that we have right now here in Downton time, because it is a short run of this first Labor government. Tell us a little bit about what they're achieving and why Daisy might be let down.
So one thing to remember about the Labour Party is it's an avowedly socialist party, though not revolutionary socialist, which, if we think about our political system, we don't have anything in mainstream politics like that. So it is different. It's more similar to European political systems. But there are all kinds of expectations, because they've never had a Labour government before, expectations for people who might expect a lot of reforms, hope for major reforms transforming society, and expectations from those who feared the Labour government. We saw that a little bit from the family, from Robert and others, even from Carson, that everything is going to come collapsing down. And the government that comes in 1924 isn't really in a position to make those kinds of changes, in part because it's what's called a minority government, so they don't have the majority of seats in Parliament. The Conservatives actually have more seats in Parliament, but they also don't have a majority. And the Liberals, so there's 3 parties in this point, and the Liberals decide to support Labour forming a government. And so Labour has about 30% of the vote, but the Prime Minister becomes a Labour Prime Minister.
Okay.
And that's one of the reasons why the government is also so unstable. And as soon as the Liberals decide to withdraw their support, then the government collapses. So that lasts about 10 months. And during those 10 months, they don't have a majority in Parliament, so they can't.
So they can't get anything done.
They can't get anything particularly radical done. So they do things like a large expansion of a housing program, public housing program, things like that. But there's no major transformation of society. The big thing that's achieved by the Labour Party with this 1924 government is they prove themselves reliable as a party in government. And in order to become a legitimate alternative, they needed to get rid of that fear factor, at least to some extent, and prove that they could be trusted to govern. And the leader of Labour Party, Ramsay MacDonald, is not a firebrand, and he's a kind of conciliatory person, and does a good job of that, of looking ministerial and looking like he belongs in office, and so Labour could be trusted.
Because they are elected again, and
yes, they're elected again in the late 1920s, and that also doesn't go very well.
Okay.
Basically, they get caught up in the economic crisis, what we call the Depression here, and that the Labour Party actually sort of pulls apart, and MacDonald ends up in what they call a national government, joining with the Conservatives. But then at the end of World War II, the Labour Party wins a very large victory and has a big majority in Parliament and can make significant changes. So that's about 2 decades after where we are in the show. But it's a long process from the party just starting at the beginning of the 20th century, and this is kind of a midpoint where they are having a chance in office. They don't destroy society, they don't do anything too radical, and they become the alternative to the Conservatives. But if you were Ms. Bunting, you're disappointed that there were not major changes.
right. And Daisy
Is learning from that.
Right, and Daisy now in this episode is disappointed in that too.
Yeah.
But they have high hopes, so.
Right, but the others seem to be more patient and have a little bit of a longer-term view.
Right.
Mr. Mason.
We have a couple calls I'd like to go to. Sally from Bradford, go ahead with your question, please.
Hi, I would like to know whether Mrs. Crawley, the man she's supposed to marry, I want to know why, when his son spoke up against her, why he did not speak up. And I mean, he is the head of the family. He should have spoken up and kicked his son out of the dinner. I mean, I don't understand why he did not say something. And
I think I'm with you. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, well, so we're wondering why Lord Merton did not speak up on Isabel's behalf. He just sat there and took it.
Yeah, didn't he say, won't you leave? Didn't he ask him to leave?
Yes, I think he asked Larry to leave.
But I mean,
and he said he had,
eventually.
this is the second time he's had to apologize for Larry
yeah,
at this table.
She's saying to begin with. I mean, why would he let him get all this out and just say, enough with it. Come on, defend your woman here, your bride.
I think he would have. I don't know why he even invited him to the dinner.
I know. I feel like he had to have some. He had to have talked about his son or had some sense that this was coming. So it's probably in poor taste to not at least prep her for they're a little reluctant or you might have some pushback. So I think that's a great question.
She didn't seem prepared for it.
No.
She seemed like she was kind of surprised by the whole thing,
Right.
ambushed by the whole thing. But it may be, if you think about his description of his marriage, all that unhappy marriage, and how did he deal with conflict for all those years, it may be that in his family this is just how he dealt with it.
And he said the sons took after
Right.
their mother in every way.
Right.
So there you go.
That's a great question.
Yeah. We go now to Becky from Myersville. Go ahead with your question, Becky.
Hi. I've been watching Downton Abbey ever since the beginning of everything, and Mary's romances, and I have been watching how she has changed from Lord Gillingham now to why can't I say
Charles.
his name?
Charles
Yes,
Blake?
Charles. But I have an interesting concept. She and Branson are both in charge, kind of jointly, with the new management, and I think that this might be a possibility that someday they may develop a romantic hook up and be able to, and this might be a new thing that's in the making that no one's expecting.
I think we've heard that theory a few times, so we're hypothesizing about Mary and Branson, Tom, getting together. And I mean, I don't know how him going to the U.S. is going to bode, but I feel like they've had some nice moments. They've definitely had some chemistry, but I think
it's a brother
sister like,
chemistry.
and they become very
Yes,
affectionate. But so I think.
I don't
don't know.
I don't think we would see that. I mean, it's certainly a good theory, but
We love both the characters.
we
but
do love both the characters so much. But
She seems to have an eye for glamour.
she does. She does seem to have an eye for glamour. I don't know. I don't think that also, I think it would be a little bit awkward to move on to your sister's
Yeah, and the
husband.
kids are cousins.
And the kids are cousins. That might be a little bit awkward, but it's an interesting theory. We go now to Sally from Indiana. Sally, go ahead with your question, please.
Sally, are you? Do you have a question?
Yes.
So Sally.
Yes, I was wondering about Anna. Yes, I was wondering about Anna Bates and Mr. Bates. Hello?
Hello. Yeah, Anna and Mr. Bates.
Yes, I was wondering about, even in the privacy of their own residence, they're calling each other Mr. and Mrs. Bates. Would that be normal?
Yeah, we actually had a question about how Anna and Mr. Bates call each other Mr. and Mrs. Bates, even in private. And I think we had discussed this, I don't know, a few weeks ago, and figured it was kind of an endearment. You know how sometimes it's like, you know, some people call mother or father. I think Mr. and Mrs. Bates is just kind of their way of relating to each other.
Yeah, I don't know, Andy. What do you think about that?
Well, he calls her Anna, though, I think, doesn't he? I don't
I
think
forget that I've ever heard him call her Anna. Does he?
Does he call her Mrs. Bates?
I think he does.
She always calls him.
She always calls him Mr. Bates. Yep, it could be that that's how she was supposed to refer to him when they met. Although it's odd that she was already a lady's maid, so he would have called her. Everyone calls her Anna, but they call Baxter. That's a little bit odd. I think it sort of might tie back into an era when there was less of a kind of romantic link and people married because it was just a convenient person to marry. It made sense, and there was a little bit more distance. But they don't seem that way. They seem to have kind of companionate marriage built on love and romance, but they're still sort of old-fashioned in using that kind of language, it seems. A
And
little
she
bit
always has
incongruous.
that kind of twinkle in her eye.
She does. She definitely does. I want to go to an email. This is one that I was actually kind of thinking myself too. John writes, I believe now that Hitler and the brown shirts are active, isn't Poland a rather dangerous place to be? He, meaning Charles Blake, could end up like Edith Suter.
Oh, I hope not.
And I was actually wondering that too when he said he was going to Poland. Now I know, like we're still in the early
too early.
stages.
Yes, it's too early.
It's too early.
So there was a period when the Nazis were very active in Munich.
Right.
Munich was a very unstable situation in 1923, and there were gangs of thugs, including the Nazis, roaming and beating people up and so on. But Poland is not involved with that. So the Nazis invade Poland in September of 1939, so that's 15 years away. So Poland is not going to be relevant. The Nazis are not going to be relevant in Poland, and even in Germany at this point, Hitler would be in prison. He spends about a year in prison, and the Nazis are really not a factor while he's in prison, and for quite some time afterwards, they're sort of rebuilding, and it's not until the Depression hits at the end of the 1920s that they become much, much bigger and much, much more active.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and we talked a little bit about the changes in housing in the great estates, but you know, a big part of this season has been the changes in Pip's Corner and the building that the Crawleys are doing there. Tell us a little bit about the state of housing in post-World War I and you know, what's happening in England right now.
So there was, for a long time, dramatic shortages of housing, but people didn't pay as much attention to it. And then in World War I, there was a kind of commitment to the soldiers coming home to give them a better life. That was sort of part of the deal. There was conscription, a draft, which was a new thing, and there was a lot of opposition to that, and this was sort of the way it was sold to the people is, yes, but the world will be better after the war. And it turns out to be a tremendous challenge because the housing situation is so poor and it takes so much to rebuild or to expand housing, to provide adequate housing. And the government just doesn't have that kind of resources. There's a lot of debt from the war. The war was incredibly expensive, and Britain spends money it doesn't have, borrows huge amounts of money from the United States. And to try to get this going and rebuild the housing is a huge challenge. So they're trying, but it takes a long time, and it's not so easy to fill in those gaps.
So real quick, what do you hope to see in the last couple episodes that are coming up, Andy?
Well, I'm with the caller. I hope that Tom doesn't go to Boston, because I think that tension is really an interesting part of the show, and seeing his identity and his struggles. I like that, and I'm interested to see where Daisy goes.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We apologize to Carol, Dennis, and Dawn, who we didn't get to hear from there in the queue, and we hope you'll call us next week. So thanks to our guest, Andy August, Professor of History at Penn State Abington. And thank you for watching. Be sure to like us on Facebook.com/AfterAbbeyTV. We hope you'll join us next week. For all of us here at WPSU, I'm Whitney Sheridan, along with Lindsay Whistle. Have a great night.